The first thing I always see when my mind drifts back is that small wooden post at the edge of the trees. Just a simple stake in the soil no taller than my knee with a metal plaque that catches the light in thin, silvery flashes whenever the wind nudges the branches overhead. The clearing around it is quiet in that heavy way forests get when the day is almost over, the air cool against my face carrying the faint damp smell of moss and creek water. You can hear the soft hiss of leaves rubbing against one another, a few insects buzzing close to the ground, and every so often a single crow calling from somewhere you can't see. The earth underfoot is uneven and spongy roots pushing up through the top layer of pine needles, my boot soles making almost no sound as I shift my weight. Off to one side, just beyond where the marker stands, an old fire ring sits half collapsed, its stones blackened and crumbling with age. The last time I was there, the sky was turning that pale, washed-out blue you get just before dusk, and a thin veil of fog was starting to rise from the low spots near the creek. I remember standing still for a long time, listening to the water moving over stone, feeling how cold the air got the moment the sun slipped behind the ridge. And even without anyone saying a word, the whole place felt like it was holding its breath. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I grew up in a neighborhood where you could tell the time by the sounds alone. In the mornings, before the sun had burned off the dew, you'd hear the low rumble of school buses grinding up the hill, the squeak and slam of screen doors, and the hollow clatter of trash cans being dragged back up driveways. By late afternoon, when the light turned soft and golden over Maple Heights, the air smelled like cut grass fryer oil from the diner on the corner, and a faint metallic tang that drifted in from the mills closer to the river. Ours was the kind of street where kids rode their bikes in looping figure-eights across the asphalt, until the streetlights flickered on and you always knew whose mom was cooking what, because the steam rolled out of open kitchen windows and mixed right there in the cooling air. Back in 1983, I was 22, still living at home with my mom in our small brick house with the cracked front steps and the hydrangea bush she kept insisting wasn't dying, just resting. Inside, everything smelled like coffee and furniture polish and the faint, sweet dust of old books. I'd finished up a couple years of community college and was working at a hardware store off the main road while I tried to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, a question that sounded simpler then than it turned out to be. Most evenings I came home with the smell of lumber and fertilizer clinging to my clothes, my palms rough from stocking shelves and cutting keys. I'd walk past our whirring box fan through the living room with its low hum of the television and head straight to the kitchen where the radio on the windowsill was usually playing some soft rock station on low. My Aunt Laura lived 3 houses down on the same side of the street. If I opened our front door at dinner time, I could hear her laughter drift up the block thinner and higher than my mom's, always punctuated by the scrape of a chair or the clink of dishes. Her house looked like ours from the outside, same brick, same shallow porch, but felt different the second you stepped inside. There was the smell of crayons and construction paper and whatever she'd baked that week with her second graders, banana bread, sugar cookies, odd little muffins made from recipes the kids brought in. The kitchen table was always cluttered with graded worksheets, stickers, and a ceramic bowl overflowing with Emily's and Jake's latest treasures: marbles, rubber bands, seashells, bits of shiny rock picked up from playgrounds and parking lots. Uncle Dan was the steady center of it all, the kind of man who moved through a room like he'd been there 1,000 times and expected to come back 1,000 more. He'd been at the steel fabrication plant since he was barely older than I was then, and the job showed on him, the faint smell of oil and hot metal in his clothes, the roughness of his hands, the way he stood with his shoulders set like he'd spent the day holding something heavy. Even on his days off, he wore flannel shirts and jeans that already had a slight gray film from the factory dust that never seemed to wash out. When he laughed, it was a low rolling sound, but most evenings he was quiet, content to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, listening more than talking while the kids chattered, and Laura filled him in on her classroom. Emily at 12 already had a seriousness about her that reminded me of her mother. She wore her brown hair in two tight braids that brushed the middle of her back, and she carried books everywhere tucked against her chest, as if she were afraid they might get knocked out of her hands. If you watched closely, you could see her lips moving just the slightest bit as she read, like she wanted to taste every word. On late summer afternoons, she'd claim the far end of their couch, angling herself toward the window, so she could read by the last of the natural light, the dust motes spinning in the air around her like slow, lazy snow. The television could be blaring, Jake could be chasing his plastic X-Wing fighter across the rug, and she'd stay there completely absorbed, occasionally pushing her glasses up higher on her nose with one finger. Jake was the opposite, all motion and noise and sticky fingers. At 9, he seemed unable to walk anywhere when he could run his sneakers slapping against the walkway, his voice always a little too loud. The boy had a way of tracking dirt that defied reason. He could go out into the yard for 5 minutes and come back with grass stains on his knees, smudges on his cheeks, and something mysterious and sticky on his shirt. He knew the Star Wars movies by heart and hummed the opening theme constantly off-key, but happy drumming his fingers on the kitchen table like he could conduct the whole thing himself. You could tell where he'd been in the house by the trail of Lego's snack crumbs and the faint smell of peanut butter or grape jelly left in his wake. Early that September, the air started to change. You could feel it first thing in the morning when you stepped out to get the paper, that thin, cool layer sitting on your skin before the sun climbed high enough to warm the sidewalk. The leaves along our street were still mostly green, but their edges had started to dull, and every gust of wind brought down a few early overachievers that skittered across the asphalt with a dry, papery whisper. The sky looked higher somehow, a little clearer, and in the evenings you could see your breath if you stayed outside late enough. At Laura's house, the box fan disappeared from the living room window, replaced by the gentle creak of the old sash as she cracked it open to let in the cooler air. You could smell burning leaves now and then, someone a few blocks over ignoring the town guidelines and raking their whole yard into a smoking pile. It was the start of the school year, so Laura was busier, her handwriting cramped and a little messier as she worked through stacks of lesson plans at the table. Sometimes I'd stop in after my shift at the hardware store and find her with a pencil stuck through her ponytail, a faint streak of green marker on her wrist, the faint, chalky smell of dry erase boards clinging to her shirt. Emily would be at the other end of the table pretending not to listen while Laura quizzed her about her own classes. Jake would be sprawled on the linoleum floor with his action figures making sound effects that bounced off the cabinets and rang in your ears long after he carried his little fleet off to the living room. In those nights, the whole house smelled like coffee tomato sauce and laundry detergent. Warm, ordinary smells that drifted out through the screen door and into the cooling street. My mom and Laura had a routine as reliable as the evening news. Most Tuesdays and Thursdays, my mom would walk down with a container of something she'd cooked too much of: meatloaf chicken and rice, sometimes just a stack of still warm cornbread wrapped in a dish towel. The sound of her sandals on the sidewalk had a particular rhythm, a soft slap and scrape I could pick out even with traffic humming in the distance. She'd come back an hour later, smelling like Laura's vanilla candles, her voice just a little hoarser from laughing. Occasionally, if I wasn't too tired, I'd go with her, and we'd sit around that crowded kitchen table, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead while the coffee pot burbled in the corner. That's when I first started hearing about the last camping trip. Dan had a way of saying it that made it sound both practical and a little wistful, his fingertips tapping lightly on the chipped mug in front of him. He'd talk about one more weekend up at the spot before the weather turned and before Emily's and Jake's school schedules got busy. When he described the place, his voice softened. He talked about the clearing near the creek, how you could hear the water running at night if you kept the tent flap cracked, and how the stars seemed to sink lower there like you could almost reach up and touch them. While he spoke, Laura would rub her thumb along the rim of her cup, nodding the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth, her eyes reflecting the yellow kitchen light. I'd been out to the Allegheny National Forest with them once a few years earlier, and the memory of that place stayed with me. The air there felt different, cooler and damper, carrying the smell of wet stone pine sap and whatever wildflowers happened to be blooming along the roadside. When the wind moved through the canopy, it came in waves, rustling one section of the forest at a time, so the sound rolled around you like distant surf. At night, when the fire died down to a soft orange glow, the darkness pressed in close so complete you could hear your own breathing and the faint trickle of the creek just beyond the ring of light. For all the years since that particular shade of black, the kind you only get far from town lights, can still make my chest tighten if I sit with it too long. In the days leading up to that mid-September weekend, the house next door seemed to hum with preparation. You could see sleeping bags draped over the porch railing to air out their nylon shells, catching the afternoon sun, and hear the muffled thumps and zips of gear being checked in the garage. The smell of charcoal lighter fluid and canvas drifted across the narrow strip of yard between our houses. Emily would pass by our front window with an armful of paperbacks, sorting and resorting the stack as she tried to decide which book deserved the precious space in her pack. Jake ran back and forth between the car and the kitchen, carrying bundles of plastic utensils, bags of marshmallows, and boxes of cereal, each trip punctuated by the slap of the screen door and the high, excited pitch of his running commentary. On one of those evenings, I remember standing at the edge of their driveway with Dan, the sky streaked with pink and orange, the air already cooling on the back of my neck. He was checking the air in the tires of the old station wagon, the hose hissing softly as he pressed the gauge against each valve. The hood of the car felt smooth and just a little warm under my palm. He talked casually about the route he planned to take, which back roads were less crowded, how early he wanted to leave to beat the traffic heading north. There was nothing unusual in his voice, nothing strained, just that steady, practical tone I'd heard my entire life. Still, there was a moment quick enough that I might have imagined it when he paused, squinting up at the sky like he was trying to read something in the fading light, then shook his head and went back to what he was doing. If there were cracks in those days, I didn't see them then. Looking back now, with all I know, I find myself replaying every small detail, every sound, every glance. I think about how Laura's laugh sounded a little thinner that week, like she was tired but didn't want anyone to notice. I think about the way Emily lingered on our front steps one afternoon, the rubber of her sneakers squeaking softly as she rocked back and forth, asking me if I thought the woods were scarier at night or first thing in the morning. I remember how Jake's energy seemed almost too much for his small frame, how he bounced on the couch cushions while he rattled off his plans for ghost stories and s'mores, his socks making a faint swishing sound against the fabric. None of it felt ominous at the time. It just felt like a family excited for a little escape before the grind of fall really set in. The Friday they were set to leave, the day unfolded like any other on our street. That morning the sun came up pale and hazy, a thin veil of clouds dimming it enough that the air stayed cool longer than usual. You could hear the familiar chorus of engines, garbage trucks shaking the ground as they lurched down the block, the staccato bark of a dog 2 houses over, the faint music leaking from someone's open bathroom window. By late afternoon, the heat finally arrived, pressing down just enough that the tar on the road smelled sharp and strong. I got home from work with a faint ache in my lower back and a light dusting of sawdust on my forearms, the screen door giving its usual protesting squeal as I pushed it open. From our front porch, I could see their driveway busy and bright in the slanting light. The station wagon's rear hatch was propped open, revealing a neat stack of gear. The rolled-up canvas tent, the bundled poles, the cooler, the camping stove, and those familiar sleeping bags. The metal buckles clinked softly as Dan shifted things around, adjusting and readjusting until it all fit just the way he wanted. Laura stepped in and out of the house, the smell of her perfume and whatever she'd been cooking drifting faintly out each time the door swung wide. She wore that blue windbreaker she seemed to live in once the weather cooled, the nylon whispering softly when she moved her arms. I remember telling myself I'd go down in a minute to say goodbye, that I'd grab a quick shower first to rinse off the day's grit. Inside, the steam from the bathroom curled up around the mirror, fogging my reflection until I could barely see my own face. The water beat against my shoulders with a steady, comforting rhythm, and for a few brief moments, all the sounds from outside were reduced to a muted wash of noise. By the time I toweled off and dressed, the light outside had softened further, taking on that amber glow that makes the whole street look like a photograph. I walked out onto our porch and leaned against the cool metal railing, feeling the evening air settle around me. The cicadas were already starting up in the trees behind the houses, their droning call rising and falling like waves. A car passed by slowly, its tires whispering over the pavement, a radio playing something tinny and distant through the open window. Down the street, porch lights clicked on one by one, casting small, warm circles on stoops and flower pots. I looked toward the Harper's house, expecting to see taillights easing away or kids' heads bobbing in the back window. Instead, what I remember is the stillness. Their curtains were half drawn, catching the last of the light, and the station wagon was no longer in the driveway. The only thing that stood out was the small light over their front door, already burning, even though the sky wasn't fully dark yet, its yellow glow soft against the brick. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the insects, the distant hum of the highway, and the faint click of our own porch bulb warming up behind me, for reasons I couldn't have put into words. Then the quiet on that end of the street felt just a shade heavier than it usually did, like the air itself was waiting for something that hadn't quite happened yet. It started with little things, the sort of details you don't notice when you still believe everything is fine. Late Friday night, after I'd finished a bowl of reheated stew and let the television drone on in the background, I glanced out our front window and saw their porch light still burning. It glowed a muted yellow against the brick, steady and soft, the way it always did when Laura wanted the kids to feel safe coming home from playing with friends. But that night, the yard stayed empty. No late runback for forgotten toothbrushes, no shuffle of car doors or last-minute checks for jackets. Just that quiet square of light holding its ground in the cooling air without a single shadow moving behind it. The crickets along the tree line behind our houses hummed with the same lazy rhythm they always did in early fall, but something in the sound felt thinner, like a layer had been peeled away. I remember closing the curtains, telling myself they were already miles into the woods, nowhere near that lamp, and pushing the unease down where I thought it would stay. The next morning began like any other Saturday. The sun slipped over the rooftops in a pale band of gold, and the smell of someone's bacon drifted across the street. I padded into our kitchen, bare feet cold on the linoleum, and put on a pot of coffee. My mother was already at the table, leafing through bills, tapping the corner of one envelope against her thumbnail in a rhythm she didn't seem aware of. The radio on the counter played the usual weekend chatter, a soft country song drifting just above the sound of the percolator. Everything felt steady, unhurried. It was the kind of morning you settle into without thinking. Sometime before 9, when the sunlight got bright enough to wash out the shadows under the maple trees, the phone rang. I didn't think anything of it at first. Our phone rang all the time. My mother answered with her usual Walker residence, and her tone didn't change until a few seconds later, when she paused mid-breath. I watched her shoulders straighten, watched her free hand hover above the table, as if she needed something to hold on to. When she set the receiver down, her voice was careful. "It's strange," she said, looking at me with a frown she couldn't quite place. "Your aunt was supposed to check in with the school this morning." She didn't. It wasn't like Laura to miss anything tied to her classroom. But it was Saturday, and people running late or forgetting minor commitments wasn't exactly news. I shrugged it off, even joked that maybe she'd finally let herself sleep in. My mother didn't laugh. She kept glancing at the clock above the sink, the minute hand moving with that hollow tick you can hear only when the room is too quiet. By early afternoon, the air outside had turned warm and a little sticky. We had the windows open to catch whatever breeze wandered through, and the curtains lifted and fell like slow breaths. I spent an hour cleaning the garage, the smell of oil and old paint drifting up from the concrete, but I kept finding myself drifting back to the driveway, listening for the familiar rumble of the station wagon. Every so often, I'd wipe my palms on my jeans and tell myself I was being ridiculous. They were out in the woods doing what they did every fall, nothing strange about that. But by mid-afternoon, my mother was calling Laura's house again, pressing the phone to her ear and listening to it ring out into nothing. She tried Dan's number at the plant, even though we both knew he wouldn't be there on a Saturday. When she hung up the second time, she exhaled through her nose the way she did when she was trying to keep something steady inside. "I'll feel better when I hear from them," she said, pushing her hair behind her ear the way she always did when her mind was running ahead of her. The hours stretched longer than they should have. The sky dimmed earlier than I expected, the color shifting from warm gold to that bluish gray that settles in before dusk. You could smell the coolness coming, the faint mineral scent of the air changing. I remember stepping out onto the porch, rubbing my arms against the sudden chill, and hearing only the far-off hum of a car on the highway. No laughter, no familiar footsteps, no station wagon easing into its usual spot. That night, my mother left the kitchen light on, though she didn't say why. She kept walking over to the front window, pulling back the curtain just an inch, staring down the street as if she could will the headlights to appear. I sat beside her for a while, watching the quiet settle over the neighborhood. The crickets were louder now, their chirping rising and falling in long waves. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, sharp and quick, then stopped. The silence after it felt heavier. We went to bed later than usual. I lay awake listening to the faint whir of the box fan in the hallway, the blades clicking slightly each time they rotated. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept picturing the Harpers' packed gear, the cooler, the tent, the kids darting around the yard with all that excitement bubbling out of them. I told myself I was simply missing the noise they brought to the block, that families came home late from weekend trips all the time. Sunday morning brought no relief. The sunlight looked duller than it should have, the air cooler. My mother looked tired, the kind of tired that settles into the corners of a person's eyes. She made coffee, but it tasted weak, as if she'd forgotten how many scoops she used. Around 10, she decided to drive to the Harper's house, an act I recognized as worry, slipping into something firmer. She asked if I wanted to come along. I said yes before she finished the question. When we stepped onto their porch, the boards creaked beneath our weight, and the faint smell of damp leaves hovered in the air. My mother knocked gently the first time. No answer. She knocked louder, her fingernails tapping against the doorframe. I could hear the echo inside the house, but no footsteps followed it. The small window beside the door was dark. My mother reached into her purse for the spare key she kept for emergencies, and her fingers trembled just slightly when she fitted into the lock. Inside the house felt undisturbed. Not cold, not warm, just empty. The faint smell of dish soap lingered in the kitchen, and a mug on the counter held a thin ring of dried coffee. The dish towel was folded neatly beside the sink. Everything looked exactly as it should have, which somehow made the air feel wrong. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, its motor clicking once every few seconds. My mother walked through the room slowly, her shoes whispering over the carpet, calling out the kids' names in a soft, hopeful voice. Nothing answered her except the faint creak of floorboards settling. We checked only the rooms we had reason to check, their bedrooms. The small hallway, the living room still cluttered with crayons and half-finished worksheets. Nothing was out of place. Nothing suggested they'd come home in the night. Everything suggested the opposite. We returned outside with a deeper quiet between us than before. My mother looked down the street, shading her eyes from the late morning sun, as if she were expecting to see the station wagon rounding the corner right then. The breeze had picked up. You could hear it rustling through the maple leaves, carrying that crisp early autumn smell of damp earth. For a moment, I honestly believed it would all resolve in the next minute. A car would appear. Laura would wave from the passenger seat, and the weight pressing on my chest would lift. Instead, the day dragged on. Calls were made to the school, to a co-worker of Dan's, to a friend of Emily's mother. Each answer was the same: no one had heard from them. No message left. No quick note to say they'd be home later than expected. By mid-afternoon, my mother was pacing in front of our window, her hands clasped together, her breathing shallow. I sat on the couch, elbows on my knees, staring at the floorboards and trying to imagine every reasonable explanation I could think of. Car trouble, a dead battery, a mix-up about the day, anything. But with each hour that passed, those explanations shrank. Just before dusk, when the light had thinned into that muted bluish haze, I stepped outside to clear my head. The air had a bite to it, that sudden drop in temperature you feel only in September. The street was quieter than usual for a Sunday evening. A few porch lights flickered on, casting small pools of light onto driveways. I stood at the end of our walkway, arms crossed against the chill, and tried to shake the feeling settling into my spine. That's when I noticed the sound, a slow, gravelly crunch coming from the far end of the block. It wasn't a familiar engine or the neighbor's rusty truck. It was deeper, steadier. A vehicle moving cautiously, like the driver wasn't entirely sure of the address. I watched as headlights appeared between the houses, their beams stretching long across the pavement. As the cruiser approached, its tires rolled over the loose stones along the curb, making that distinctive, uneven sound that always seems too loud in a quiet neighborhood. The red and blue lights weren't on, but the emblem on the door was unmistakable. The patrol car pulled to the side and idled at the edge of the Harper's driveway. The engine clicked as it cooled. The driver's door opened with a muted thump, and a uniformed officer stepped out, adjusting his belt with one hand. He stood there for a moment, scanning the street, the air unmoving around him. Then he looked toward our house. When our eyes met, he lifted his hand in a small, steady wave, more a request than a greeting. My mother appeared behind me on the porch, her breath catching in that soft, fragile way I'd only heard a handful of times in my life. The officer took a slow step forward, clearing his throat, the gravel shifting under his boots. And that was when the last of my denial finally slipped away, replaced by a cold, sinking certainty I couldn't yet name. The sun had dropped below the roofs, leaving only the faintest trace of light along the treetops. The street was almost dark now, the kind of dimness where you can feel the night settling in even before it fully arrives. The officer removed his hat. The wind stopped. And everything in me knew we were stepping into something we couldn't turn back from. The deputy who stepped onto our porch that evening spoke in a low, even tone, the kind used by people who've delivered news like this before and know there's no gentle way to do it. The porch light hummed faintly above us, drawing small moths that fluttered against the glass with soft taps. My mother stood beside me with her arms wrapped around herself, her fingertips digging lightly into her sweater sleeves, as if she were trying to hold something steady inside. The deputy explained that the Harpers hadn't checked in with anyone, hadn't been seen, and hadn't returned home. Their campsite lay somewhere in a vast stretch of forest, and they hadn't made contact since Friday evening. Hearing it spoken aloud in that measured voice made the air feel suddenly thinner, like we were standing at a great height. When the deputy asked if we had any recent information or if they'd mentioned plans beyond the usual, the question echoed inside me long after he walked back to his cruiser. The engine started with a low rumble, the headlights sweeping across our lawn, and for the first time it hit me that this was no longer a case of a family running late. Something larger had begun to unfold. The next morning came early, long before sunrise had a chance to warm the chill that settled over the neighborhood. I woke to the sound of car doors shutting up and down the block, neighbors heading to work, deliveries being dropped off. But underneath all of that was the unfamiliar growl of engines idling somewhere close. When I stepped outside, the air tasted metallic and cold, the kind of cold that settles deep in your lungs. Down the street, 2 county vehicles were parked side by side with their hazard lights blinking amber in the dim light. Several deputies stood with their hands tucked into their jackets, their breath rising in faint, steady clouds. A ranger truck from the Forest Service eased to a stop behind them, its tires crackling over the damp gravel. The deputies asked again if we'd heard anything overnight. My mother shook her head, and I felt her hand graze my arm, a small grounding touch. They explained they'd be heading north toward the Harpers' usual camping area, checking the pull-offs and narrow roads leading into the woods. A map was taped to the hood of one of the vehicles, the corners fluttering slightly in the breeze. The ranger, tracing a path with his finger, had the calm focus of a man who'd spent years reading terrain most people never saw. As they spread out radios clipped to their shoulders, crackling with bursts of static, I felt something shift inside me, a slow, heavy realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding that would tidy itself up by noon. The forest was enormous, the weather cooling, and the Harpers were somewhere inside it. By mid-morning, a small convoy headed into the hills, dust rising behind the trucks in pale plumes that drifted away on the wind. My mother insisted I stay close in case more questions arose, so I found myself pacing between our porch and the sidewalk, listening for anything out of place. Each hour felt longer than the last. The sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that the scent of damp leaves and pine sap drifted from the woods miles away. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter thumped its way across the sky, low and slow, though I couldn't tell if it was part of the search or just passing through. The thrum of its blades lingered in my chest long after the sound faded. Late that afternoon, one of the deputies returned with an update. They'd located the Harpers' station wagon at the edge of a clearing near the creek, right where Dan liked to set up camp. He told us the car was intact, doors shut, keys inside. That was all he said, but the way he paused between those words made the air feel heavier again. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes closing for just a second, and I felt the world tilt in a way that made my stomach tighten. They needed volunteers. They said people who knew the trails, people willing to walk long distances through uneven ground. My mother insisted on staying home in case family called, but I didn't think twice. I drove behind one of the county vehicles, the road winding through hills thick with trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. The closer we got to the forest, the cooler the air became, carrying the scent of wet bark and soil. By the time we reached the staging area, a thin fog clung to the low spots in the ground, curling around the bases of the pines like smoke. There were more vehicles than I expected. Park ranger trucks, county cruisers, volunteer pickups with rope water jugs and worn boots tossed into their beds. People stood in small groups near the clearing, speaking in subdued voices, their words muffled by the quiet of the woods. The only clear sound was the creek nearby, its steady trickle threading through the trees. Someone handed me a reflective vest and a radio, the plastic cold and stiff in my hands. As the teams assembled, a sergeant unfolded a large map on the hood of a truck. His gloved finger moved across the ridges and valleys, marking off sections with heavy strokes. The wind rustled the paper, and he anchored 2 corners with stones. He spoke evenly, outlining the day's plan, but behind his voice was a tension that didn't belong to a run-of-the-mill search. People listened closely, the crunch of leaves under their boots, the only sound when he paused. The first few hours were spent walking slow, deliberate lines through the underbrush. We called out their names in intervals, our voices carrying through the trees and echoing back in faint hollow tones. The ground was soft in some places, firm in others, and every few steps I had to adjust to keep my footing. My breath rose in thin plumes as the day cooled, and the low sun filtered through the branches in sharp slants of gold. Each time we approached a bend in the trail or a break in the trees, my pulse quickened. Every rustle of leaves made me pause. The woods had a way of amplifying even the smallest sounds, turning them into something that felt significant. A group to our west thought they'd found a footprint, but after a closer look, the tread didn't match anything the Harpers owned. Another team reported spotting a bit of blue fabric snagged on a branch, only to discover it was from an old tarp someone had left behind years ago, brittle and sun-bleached. A search dog caught scent near a shallow ravine. its bark sharp and urgent, but the trail drifted off near the creek, dissolving into nothing but the cold mineral smell of water and stone. By late afternoon, the air had turned sharper, the light dimming faster beneath the canopy. The volunteers grew quieter, fatigue settling into their shoulders. Radios crackled with brief check-ins. Section clear, moving north. No sign, each message flattening. The hope inside me bit by bit. At one point, while stopping to catch my breath, I heard the wind shift and carry a faint, distant clatter, as if something metallic had struck against wood. I turned toward the sound, waiting, but it never came again. I told one of the rangers, and he made a note marking a small circle on the edge of the map, but when that patch of woods was searched later, it turned up nothing. Theories began drifting through the ranks long before anyone spoke them with confidence. A seasoned hiker mentioned the risk of slipping near the creek, though his voice lacked conviction. Another muttered that sometimes people panic and run off trail, but no one saw the Harpers as the panicking type. A young deputy new to the area mentioned the possibility of encountering someone dangerous in the woods. His partner shot him a look that told him to keep that thought quiet. Rumors started their slow crawl through the volunteers' half-formed ideas about strangers on back roads, old stories of hunters wandering too far, the occasional mention of an unfamiliar truck seen near the forest entrance earlier that week. Nothing stuck. Nothing fit neatly. As night approached, lanterns glowed near the staging area, their soft light reflected in puddles and on the surfaces of truck hoods. Steam rose from cups of coffee handed out by local volunteers, the scent warm and rich against the cold air. People spoke in low tones, rubbing their hands together or stamping their boots to keep warm. I listened to a ranger describe how in some cases the woods just swallow things. His voice quiet, not meaning it literally but haunted by the idea all the same. I felt an exhaustion unlike anything I'd known settle into my bones. Not from the physical strain, but from the weight in my chest. The knowledge that each passing hour made the ground beneath us feel bigger, looser, more impossible to cover. When I closed my eyes even for a moment, I saw their faces, the way Jake's feet swung beneath the kitchen chair when he talked too fast, the way Emily tilted her head while she read a loose strand of hair falling forward, the way Dan's voice softened when he spoke about the woods, the way Laura smiled with her whole face, a smile that reached her eyes. Those memories made the cold feel deeper. As darkness settled fully over the forest, the teams regrouped. A deputy swept a flashlight beam across the map, the paper glowing pale in the stark light. He drew a fresh line along the eastern edge, circling a new section they planned to search at first light. The creek's sound seemed louder in the quiet, steady, rhythmic, indifferent. Just as I was turning to leave, rubbing my chilled hands together and preparing for the long ride home, a voice crackled through one of the ranger radios. It was faint at first, muffled by static, but the urgency in the tone was unmistakable. Conversation stopped, heads turned. A ranger stepped closer to the radio, adjusting the volume. A few words broke through clearly, something about needing someone to take a look, something that didn't match what they'd seen so far. The sergeant leaned over the map again, marking a point with a firm press of his pencil. People drew closer, their breath visible in the cold air, a shared stillness settling over the group. In the beam of the lantern light, I watched his hand hover over that new mark, his jaw tightening for just a moment before he lowered the pencil. The night around us seemed to hold its breath, the trees standing silent, the air unmoving. Whatever they'd found, or thought they'd found, it shifted the mood in a way none of us could name. And as we stood there listening for the radio to crackle again, a quiet certainty settled deep inside me that the search was about to change direction. Something waited in those woods that we had not yet seen. The radio call that came through that evening was thin at first, barely more than a burst of static cutting through the cold air. I remember standing near the line of parked trucks, warming my hands around a cup of coffee someone had pressed into them when the sound sharpened. A voice, strained breathless, asked for the nearest deputy to head east of the creek bed. The sergeant stiffened, turning his head slightly like he was trying to catch a distant sound. The lantern beside him flickered in the breeze, throwing long shadows across the map. When the voice came through again, more urgent this time, more focused, every conversation in that clearing stopped. You could feel the shift ripple through the crowd, a tightening that pulled everyone's attention toward the dark stretch of forest where the search teams had gone silent. A ranger stepped away from his truck, pressing 2 fingers to his earpiece, and the look that crossed his face made the hair on my arms lift. Not panic, he was too seasoned for that, but something colder, heavier. He motioned for 2 deputies, and without raising his voice, he told them to move. Their boots crunched over the leaf litter as they disappeared down the narrow path, lit only by their flashlights. The beam from one of the lanterns caught the edge of their reflective vests before the trees swallowed them whole. My chest tightened in a way I didn't have language for back then, only the sense that whatever they were walking toward was going to change everything. I followed with the second wave of volunteers, staying behind the deputies as they guided us through the forest. The night air was crisp enough to sting the back of my throat, and each breath rose in thin streams of white that drifted upward toward the dark canopy. Branches brushed against my jacket, shedding droplets of cold moisture onto my sleeves. The only sounds were our footsteps and the distant rush of the creek, which seemed louder than usual, as if the water itself sensed what we were about to find. As we got closer, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Several flashlights held low to the ground, their beams swaying slowly like they were tracing the outline of something delicate. A deputy lifted a hand when we approached, signaling us to stop. He didn't speak for a moment, just let the silence settle around us, until all I could hear was the soft ticking of cooling metal from the ranger's truck far behind us. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Stay back for now. They found something." I couldn't see much at first, only the outlines of 3 officers kneeling near a half-collapsed wall of an old hunting cabin. The cabin itself looked like it had been forgotten long before any of us were born. Roof-sagging boards warped from decades of moisture vines creeping along the foundation like fingers reclaiming what the forest once owned. The air around it smelled of damp wood and soil turned up by boots. Someone had pried off a section of the interior wall, and what lay inside the cavity made every bit of warmth drain from my body. A small, striped shirt, faded brittle, hung from a splintered stud. The colors were so washed out they blended into the wood around it, but even in that light I recognized the pattern. I felt my breath stick in my throat, my pulse dulling in my ears. Near it lay a sliver of blue nylon, torn at the edge, the fabric so fragile it came apart when an investigator tried to lift it with gloved hands. A thermos lay half embedded in the debris, its metal rusted and rough, still holding its shape despite the years. And farther in the back, where the flashlights converged, was a rectangular shape covered in dust and grime. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at: a cooler, once red, now dull, and cracked, its lid warped from time. One of the rangers reached deeper into the cavity, pulling something small and thin from a narrow crevice between 2 studs. When the light hit it, I saw the faded outline of a Pennsylvania license, the photo nearly gone, but the letters still faintly legible. The name struck the deputy like a blow. He inhaled sharply, lowered his head, and for a moment no one moved. The wind shifted through the trees, brushing cold air across my face, and in that silence, the truth that had lived beneath the surface for 36 years began to rise. I stepped back, instinctively gripping the rough bark of a nearby tree. My legs felt unsteady, as though the ground had gone soft beneath me. A deep, quiet sorrow spread through my chest, heavier with each beat of my heart. I didn't cry, not then. It wasn't shock exactly. It was more like my mind refused to understand all at once, tried to take in only fragments. The shirt, the cooler, the license, pieces of a family that had left our street on a warm September afternoon and never returned. Investigators moved quickly but carefully, speaking in low tones, marking the area with orange flags that fluttered softly in the cold breeze. The sergeant radioed for more personnel, and within minutes the small clearing filled with the soft thuds of boots and the hum of portable lights being set up. Someone taped off the cabin with wide strips of yellow barrier tape that snapped lightly in the wind. Every few minutes, a deputy would step out of the cabin, take a long breath of cold air, and steady himself before going back inside. I stayed near the edge of the clearing, my back against a tree trunk chilled by the night. My hands had started to shake, not violently, just a subtle tremor I couldn't stop. I felt older in that moment than my 22 years, and at the same time impossibly young, as if I'd stumbled into a world I wasn't prepared to enter. The forest around us seemed to absorb the lamplight, turning the edges of the clearing into soft shadows. The creek continued its steady movement over stone, a quiet, indifferent sound. It took only hours for investigators to piece together the obvious truth. The items belonged to the Harpers, every piece, every scrap. The cooler matched the model Laura had bought. The torn strips of nylon were the same shade of blue as her windbreaker. The striped shirt matched one Jake wore, often its pattern recognizable even through years of decay. And the license, that was unmistakable. That was Dan's. The years hadn't erased the letters entirely. Enough remained to confirm what we feared. Their belongings had been hidden in the walls of a cabin sitting on private land, nearly 40 miles from where they'd set up camp. The discovery narrowed the search in a way that left no room for hope. Investigators fanned out behind the cabin with quiet precision, working under temporary floodlights that cast long shadows over the uneven ground. The soil in that patch of woods was damp, dark, and heavy with the smell of decaying leaves. Cadaver dogs arrived shortly after their handlers, guiding them through the underbrush, while the rest of us stepped aside, giving them space to work. You could hear the soft padding of paws, the low, purposeful breaths of the dogs as they moved in deliberate arcs. When the first dog stopped near a shallow rise in the earth, just a slight swell covered in fallen leaves, you could feel the stillness ripple outward. The handler raised a hand and knelt beside the mound, brushing away debris with slow, practiced strokes. Another dog circled, then sat beside the first, its posture rigid and certain. Word spread through the clearing with barely a whisper. The sergeant moved toward the site, his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. I stayed back, the cold night air biting at my face. My mouth had gone dry. My heartbeat felt slow, heavy, like each beat took effort. One of the deputies walked past me, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. The quiet around us deepened as if the entire forest leaned in. Under those portable lights, with the night pressing in from every side, they began to uncover what the ground had hidden for nearly 4 decades. When the first remains were revealed, the investigators didn't say much. Not to one another, not to anyone watching. They worked with a measured reverence, lifting each fragment of earth with gloved hands. The air smelled of soil and old roots, and something colder, something that made the back of my neck prickle. I felt myself go still, rooted to the spot, breathing shallowly as the truth settled around us. They found 4 graves. 4 shallow depressions in the earth arranged in a loose semicircle behind the cabin. The soil had been disturbed long ago, then left to settle beneath seasons of rain, snow, and falling leaves. Even before the forensic teams confirmed the identities, every person present understood who lay beneath that ground. Each discovery felt like a weight pressing deeper into my chest, and I found myself leaning against a tree for support, the bark rough beneath my palm. Over the next hours, the site transformed into something quieter, more solemn. Lights glared against the tree trunks. Radios whispered. Deputies secured the perimeter while investigators worked through the night, their breath visible in the beams of their flashlights. The cold intensified, settling into my bones, but I hardly noticed. I stayed until one of the sergeants gently suggested volunteers return to the staging area. It wasn't a request so much as an understanding that we'd reached the point where only professionals should remain. Before I stepped away, I looked back at the cabin, the broken wall, the debris on the ground, the strip of fabric hanging loosely from a stud. In the harsh artificial light, the structure looked smaller than it had earlier, fragile, almost like a secret finally too tired to hold itself together. I thought about the years it had stood there with all that evidence sealed inside, waiting for someone to notice it at last. The ride back to the staging area felt longer than usual. The headlights carved narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating only what lay directly in front of us. My hands rested on my knees, still trembling faintly. No one in the truck spoke, not even a murmur. The silence between us was its own language, a mixture of grief, disbelief, and the quiet knowledge that the Harpers' story had shifted irrevocably. When we arrived, the sheriff's office had already begun setting up tables inside a portable command trailer. A deputy handed out blankets, though I barely felt the fabric in my hands. The coffee someone poured into my cup tasted like nothing. Everything around me felt muffled, as if I were hearing the world from underwater. My mother was waiting at home, unaware of what had been found. I knew I had to tell her, but the words felt stuck too heavy to lift. Just before dawn, someone mentioned that state investigators would be arriving within the hour. A press release would need to be drafted. Family would need to be notified. The cabin and surrounding land would be closed off indefinitely. There were procedures to follow, statements to prepare, updates to coordinate. The logistics of it all moved forward as the rest of us stood frozen in that long, cold night. As I stepped outside the trailer, the first thin line of morning light appeared behind the trees, turning the sky a pale, washed-out gray. The air smelled of wet leaves and exhausted lanterns. A deputy stood nearby, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, his breath curling into the cold air. He looked at me, nodded once, a small human gesture in the middle of all that heaviness. And as the sun began to rise, casting weak light over the hills, I felt the next chapter closing in. The discovery had answered one question and opened 100 more. The truth had surfaced, but the full weight of it was only beginning to settle. I took a long breath, the cold air filling my chest, and stepped back inside, bracing myself for what the coming hours would bring. In the hours after the graves were found, the forest changed. It wasn't just the glow of the floodlights or the cluster of vehicles that gathered along the old logging road. It was the quiet that settled over everyone present, a quiet shaped by understanding. Deputies moved with a solemn purpose, speaking in low tones, their breaths rising in pale wisps into the cold morning air. A few rangers lingered near the edge of the clearing, hands tucked into their jackets, eyes fixed on the ground as if they were trying to steady themselves. I remember the faint scent of turned soil hanging in the air, rich and damp, mixing with the sharp smell of diesel from the generators. My legs felt hollow beneath me as though they belonged to someone else. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the hum of a radio, the distant roll of the creek felt amplified. By the time I made it back to town, the news had already traveled faster than any official statement. My mother met me at the door, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with the red that comes from hours of bracing for something you can't control. When I told her what had been found, she pressed both hands against her chest and exhaled a sound that wasn't a cry, but something quieter, heavier. She folded into me in a way I hadn't seen since I was a boy, her cheek warm against my shoulder, her breath trembling against my shirt. In that moment, the past and present collapsed into one painful truth: the Harpers weren't coming home. The days that followed passed in a blur of press briefings, investigators arriving from across the state, and official cars crowding the small parking lot beside the sheriff's office. The air inside that building always smelled faintly of old paper and burnt coffee, and during those long days the scent was stronger than ever. Officers moved quickly down the narrow hallways, their footsteps echoing off the linoleum, their expressions a mixture of determination and fatigue. They worked through files older than some of the deputies themselves, piecing together a timeline from interviews, land records, and long-forgotten reports. It didn't take long for the picture to come together. The land where the cabin sat had belonged to a family no one in town had thought about in years. The younger brother Thomas had lived there in a trailer for much of the early 80s. Folks who knew him remembered a man who drifted from job to job, someone who drank too much and kept to himself. He died in a car wreck in the late 80s, his truck wrapped around a tree on a back road outside Warren County. There'd been no suspicion then, no reason for anyone to dig deeper. But now, with the cabin giving up secrets long sealed behind rotting boards, the pieces aligned in a way that was painful in its simplicity. The Harpers had crossed paths with him during that September weekend, likely by chance, maybe by accident. And whatever happened next had unfolded quickly and violently. The truth was harder to absorb than I expected. It wasn't that I'd hoped for something gentler. It was that the randomness of it all left a hollow ache in my chest. A family full of warmth, laughter, and small routines had collided with a man carrying his own storms inside him, and the consequences swept through decades of lives. There was no trial, no confession, no moment where justice could be spoken aloud. Just an old cabin, a forgotten name, and the weight of what he'd left behind. The funerals took place on a cold morning in early spring. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass, crunching under the shoes of the small crowd that gathered in the cemetery just outside Pittsburgh. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that makes everything feel closer and quieter. People from every chapter of the Harpers' lives stood shoulder-to-shoulder neighbors, co-workers, old classmates of Emily and Jake, former students of Laura, who were now grown with families of their own. The wind moved gently through the trees at the edge of the cemetery, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. When the pastor spoke, his voice was steady but soft, each word rising into the cold air like a small offering. My mother stood beside me, her gloved hands clasped in front of her, her breath forming quiet clouds. I could see the pain etched around her eyes, deepened by memories of her sister's laughter. The daily phone calls they used to share the meals around crowded tables. As the caskets were lowered, a silence settled over the crowd, one that felt less like an ending and more like a long breath taken in the presence of something sacred. In the months that followed, the community moved forward in the way small towns do, slowly, gently, with a kind of shared understanding. People spoke of the Harpers with care, choosing stories that brought warmth rather than fear. The school where Laura taught hung a small plaque near her old classroom, a simple piece of brass that caught the afternoon sun. Dan's co-workers planted a tree outside the steel plant, its leaves turning bright gold each fall. And yet, even as life reclaimed its rhythms, certain places held shadows that hadn't been there before. I found myself avoiding the stretch of road leading up toward the forest for a long time. Every time I thought of that cabin, its sagging roof, the broken wall, the cold weight of the evidence inside, I felt a tightness in my throat. I knew it wasn't the forest's fault. Those woods had been part of our lives for generations. But certain memories cling to places in ways that can't be reasoned away. Even now, if I'm driving alone and the wind shifts just right, carrying the scent of pine and cold water, my chest tightens and I see that clearing in my mind. My mother kept her porch light on for weeks after the funeral, even though there was no longer a reason to believe anyone was walking home through the dark. She never said why. Some choices don't need explanations. They come from a place deeper than logic, a place where love and grief merge into something quiet and steady. Eventually, she turned it off. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she understood that remembering didn't depend on a bulb burning through the night. As the years passed, the hollow ache softened, but never disappeared. It settled into me in slow, patient layers. I became a guidance counselor later in life, and sometimes when a student sits across from me speaking about fear or loss or uncertainty, I feel the echo of that September in my chest. It reminds me to listen a little harder, to speak a little softer, to understand that every person carries something invisible behind their eyes. When I think of the Harpers now, I don't picture the cabin or the forest or the graves. I picture their kitchen bathed in warm yellow light, the sound of pencils tapping on worksheets, the clatter of pans from the stove, the hum of conversation that filled their home like a gentle current. I picture Emily on the couch, bathed in the last of the afternoon sun, absorbed in a book. I picture Jake racing across the rug with his toys, the faint scrape of plastic on wood. I picture Laura's laughter drifting out of the open window on late summer evenings, and Dan standing in the driveway with a wrench in his hand, glancing up at the sky to check the weather. Those are the echoes I choose to keep. They remind me that a family is more than the way they were lost. It's the way they lived the small, steady moments that made their home glow with a kind of gentle warmth. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the air is still, I sit by the window and let those memories come back to me. They settle in the room like soft light, and for a little while the weight in my chest feels lighter. And whenever I pass Woodridge Street in the early morning, or just as dusk settles in, I still see their porch in my mind, washed in that soft, familiar glow. The image lingers quiet, steady, patient, like a reminder that some families never really leave us. They live on in the places they touched, in the people who loved them, and in the stories we refuse to let fade. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.